Well, hey, Rainier View Christian Church, we're kicking off a brand new series this summer called Multiple Choice, and we're going to be looking at multiple minor prophets all throughout the summer, looking at a minor prophet each week. And so if you've ever spent time reading through the Bible, maybe you're a person, you're like, I'm going to try reading through the Bible in a year. You get to the minor prophets and you're like, how do I make sense of these books? There's so many terms I don't understand. There's so many harsh sounding things. How do I make sense of these? And so the temptation is, right, just to skip over them, not pay attention to them, get on to maybe like the New Testament where things make sense for you. But Joe, tell us a little bit about like why are we doing this and maybe how to just keep some basic principles in mind as we go through these books.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's because we like a challenge. I think we just want to address these books, right? Because part of it is that we skip it over. But I think it's also about some of the presumptions we bring into the minor prophets that make it so that I think we skip over it, right? I think one of the major things is that we think the minor prophets are irrelevant to our times. These are just things that happen in the Old Testament. We got Jesus in the New Testament. And so what usually happens with the minor prophets is we see the minor prophets as like Christmas time. Like we'll quote some of them, hey, Jesus is coming, and that's all they have to offer. And it's true. A lot of what the minor prophets do offer is about the future, is about how Jesus fulfills all the hopes and expectations of Israel. However, there's a lot more richness and content in the minor prophets. And specifically what they're trying to do is not just predict like what's coming down the line, right? But it's also about how do we see the world today and all of its various problems through the lens of God. And so what we'll see throughout this series is as we go over these minor prophets, each of them have a very specific situation they're facing. And you might think, oh, that's years ago, that has nothing to do with us, but there's a lot of similarities, even with those cultural differences and the time span. For instance, they'll ask questions such as, what do we do when bad things happen to good people? Right? And so what we have going on are some multiple choices. We can either say, oh, everything in the world is random, or perhaps God is doing something in the midst of tragedy. In the same way, they're going to be asking questions about what do we do about global powers? What do we do about injustice? And so on and so forth. And so what we want to do is not only analyze what's going on in the situation of the Israelites, right, and the minor prophets and what they're speaking to, and how does that bridge over to some of the similar situations we're facing today?
Yeah. And the prophets are writing kind of in a span of like 800 to 400 BC, feel like ancient history, but man, it's the same struggles that we have as people today, right? So a constant theme throughout the prophets is the people of God's idolatry, which is simply the worship of anything other than their covenant God, Yahweh, the one true creator of everything. And so this temptation to look to other sources to provide security or strength or blessing is repeatedly picked up by the prophets again and again and again. We have the same temptation today as well. We trust in ourselves, we trust in our bank accounts, we trust in other things in the world besides God to provide a sense of security for us. One of the beautiful themes of the prophets, in more of like poetic language, is that we see God's heart for the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed, and when there's injustice, what the prophets are really trying to get our attention around is that our security as a whole group is found in when I help others become secure. And I do that work of seeking after that for their behalf. People who maybe aren't like me, outside of my group, or people I overlook in my own spheres. No, the prophets say, hey, you got to care for the whole. And they have this very holistic rather than an individualistic look. But it's extremely helpful for us to navigate those very same temptations, problems, and the things we turn to that often we're scratching our head wondering, is this the best response? Is this the best answer? Is this how I ought to work through this? And so those are just a few things to keep in mind as we go through this series. Each week, we're going to be looking at, again, one of the minor prophets and really kind of picking maybe one question. We're not necessarily going to look at the entire book each week, but one question, one theme, and how does it pertain to those big questions that you and I have about how to make sense, how to choose the right course of action or the right way to think about an issue that affects all of us. So we're really excited about this summer. We hope that you're going to kind of come along for the ride and join us as we look at the minor prophets in this series, Multiple Choice. Well, maybe that gets you thinking about this question that maybe you wonder about. How do we believe in a God that is good when tragedy and catastrophe happen in our world? How can I trust that God is really there for me? And why does he permit things like natural disasters or even human-initiated warfare to be things that we experience? How do we understand that? Well, that's one of the reasons why we are in this series, Multiple Choice, and we're going to be looking today at the book of Joel, because we believe that there is ancient wisdom to help us navigate these timeless problems that befall us. Because, right, there are tragedies that all of us are going to face and walk through, whether they are, again, global issues, right? Global pandemics, whether there's warfare that might affect us or people we know around the world, to the personal level things, the cancer diagnoses, the loss of job and instability and the just difficulties that we walk through. How do we understand why those things are happening to us? And so we are trying to figure out as human beings, I believe, what's the best choice for me to make sense of it all? How do I know how to navigate and walk through those desperate times and how to deal with them? And so what's going to help me actually walk through those seasons well? And so the prophets can be like guides that help us through that. What I love about the prophets is that they just tackle these questions and these issues head on. We kind of try and avoid thinking about them a lot of the times if we're being honest, but they speak to them directly and clearly. And they really help us understand something that we lose sight of often in our modern culture. What are the foundational issues? What are the fundamental starting points for answering the question of how do we make sense of tragedy and how do we walk through tragic situations well? The prophets point us to what we need to begin with. They give us the perspective on where to start with how we view God. How you choose to view God and his interaction with you in the tragedies of life will greatly affect how you go through processing and walking through those seasons, and whether you will do so seeing them as just meaningless interactions, and that if you're just thinking, I'm just a bunch of cells processing energy and these are just random events that are happening and there's no greater meaning or purpose behind any of it, that's going to speak to how you face and how you walk through a tragic or desperate situation. On the other hand, if you see, as the prophets do, know that there is a God who is at work and walking through the tragedy alongside me, you're going to have a very different experience, very different processing of that. And so, again, one of the things that a Christian conception of God gives us is that, no, these are not just meaningless, random events that are happening, that these are, again, tragedies that sometimes are partially we're responsible for, collectively as people or maybe individually, not always, but we can make sense of them, that they're not just meaningless. Mr. Rogers is quoted as saying this once. He said, "When I was a boy and I would see the scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" And don't we all admire the helpers? Whether or not we do anything ourselves, we see those examples of those stepping in and making a difference and meeting a need, especially in time of crisis, and think, man, we really admire those individuals. But we often don't act until we're compelled to, until tragedy comes, until there's a reason and a compelling reason to do so. But one of the things that the prophets remind us of is that this idea of, it's kind of an old phrase, like living by the book. Right? We used to kind of use that phrase sometimes, we're people of the book, living by the book. If we are going to have that perspective that the prophets give us, then it means we care about the problems that we see in our world. We care about the things happening. And the minor prophets, let's be honest, are not the easiest and most simple books of the Bible to understand. But they are extremely helpful in helping us think about how to frame tragedy, how to understand it, how to walk through it. And so, again, as we see suffering in the world, as we see hurt and pain and catastrophe, the starting point that we want to begin with is just how do we think about that? Because if we think about it from a godly perspective, from a faith-centered perspective, it's going to change the way that I view it. It's going to change the way that I walk through it and respond to it. And so we're, again, starting out in the book of Joel because it was written by the prophet, or recording the prophet Joel's words, so aptly named. And we're not going to cover every verse, every theme, every question that you might have of all 3 chapters of the book of Joel, because we would be here a long time. But I just want to pick up on that thread of this one question. What do you do in desperate times? How do you deal with them? How do we answer the question of what am I supposed to do in the face of tragedy? And so we want to look at what that timeless wisdom has to say, because here's what we're going to discover. It makes a difference if we consider that God is present in the midst of it, because we'll see that tragedy, while terrible, can be like an alarm clock to awaken us to God's presence. None of us sign up to walk through a tragic moment. But while tragedy can be terrible, it can also serve like that alarm clock to awaken us to God's presence and our need for God. Now, if you're wondering who Joel is and when he's serving as a prophet to God's people in what we call the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures. Some prophets we can really narrow to a pretty narrow date range, and we know when they were speaking because of the material in their books. Joel's is different. We can't necessarily peg it. He might have served as a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel, which went into exile 722 BC for their lack of faithfulness to pursue God and follow God and honor him. He could have served as a prophet to the southern kingdom of Israel, again, in the Old Testament referred to as Judah. They were carried off into exile by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Or Joel could have been a prophet in the post-exile period, when the people of Israel returned to their land under the rule and reign first of King Cyrus of Persia and then subsequent rulers. So we don't exactly know what period Joel is serving as a prophet in, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because the question that he brings up and the answers that he gives can help any of us right now in our current time process and walk through tragedy with a different perspective. And again, his words serve as a reminder, like an alarm clock, to awaken us to our true need for God. And so we don't want to miss the opportunity to know who God is in the face of tragedy. We don't want to add that tragedy on top of terrible things that happen, missing God's presence, his awakening of our awareness of who he is in the midst of those difficulties. And so we're going to see Joel talk about this in terms of a locust swarm. And so I'm going to get to explaining what that is, but look with me at first in the first chapter of Joel, beginning chapter 1, verse 2. He says, "Hear this, you elders. Listen to all who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation. What the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, the other locusts have eaten." Okay, now again, we're going to get to explaining what a locust swarm is and how destructive it is, but there's a question here as we come to this. The prophets often use metaphoric language, and so is Joel describing a literal locust swarm, or is he using that figuratively to describe maybe a foreign army invading their land? And so, there's kind of those options are thrown out there. Most take this as, no, this is a literal locust swarm. Why? Because you look at some of the descriptors that you'll see of the devastation to the crops, as Joel goes on to say in verse 11, chapter 1. "Despair, you farmers, wail, you vine growers, grieve for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field is destroyed. The vine is dried up, and the fig tree is withered. The pomegranate, the palm, and the apple tree, and all the trees of the field are dried up. Surely the people's joy is withered away." And so you can see in this brief video just the overwhelm that a locust swarm would bring. And an epic and intense one would be so strong that it might blacken the sky, that there's not one strip of wheat or grass or anything left after a locust horde might come through. And these have happened on every continent in the world, and they happen up until today. I love this just fun picture from, fun for us, not for them, but from the farmers on the Great Plains back in the 1800s, particularly 1874. There was a terrible locust plague that went through, but I love their just sense of humor with it, that the locusts ate everything but the mortgage, okay? And you can see a picture of a more recent one as well here. Now, not exclusively, but we do need to pause here before going any further. Like, why would God allow this to happen? Well, not exclusively. We do have some interplay even with the ecological disasters that we see happening in our world. Not exclusively, but sometimes in part. Let me give you an example of one from our ancient past as people. So I had the privilege to save up for a few years. Last year, for my son's graduation trip, we went to Belize, and for one of our days, we crossed the border over to Guatemala, and we went to one of the most complete and largest Mayan ruin sites, the ruins of Tikal. And so the forest canopies everything for miles and miles and miles there. And you climb up the steps on the top of these temples, and you look out, and you can just see for miles. But one of the things that was interesting to me, the guide talked about the fact that in the peak of their civilization, don't quote me on this, maybe 9 to 800 AD, somewhere in that range, that area would have sustained well north of 1 million people. And for miles and miles and miles, the forest that we were looking at would have been clear cut. It would have been clear cut, again, for miles, in part to fuel the fire, to make and bake the limestone bricks to build those temples, and that one of the factors of the collapse of their civilization was brought on by this massive, rapid clear-cutting of the forest and the baking of these limestone bricks. And so, that's just one example. But in any generation, we need to pay attention to when we get out of balance, when we get out of harmony with the call to care for creation, to care for the world that God has created. As Christians, we should be on the forefront of people looking at how to care for the resources that God has intentionally created and has told us, you are to steward this, you are to take care of this, manage this on my behalf for me, alongside with me. And so it's one of the reasons why I just love our national parks. As you know, in the United States, we love exploring and going to different ones. We personally, as a family, have a goal to see all 63 of our nation's national parks. But I love the beauty. I love all the different climates and the grandeur and the different aspects of creation. But one of the things I love about seeing that is, man, when you're standing in the beauty of creation, it just speaks, for me, of the creator behind it. And so maybe if you're a person who's like, man, I just have a hard time figuring out how to connect with God and feeling like he's there, man, can I encourage you? Can you just shut up your phone, mute it, airplane mode, turn it off, whatever. Get out into some of the beauty of creation somewhere, anywhere, whether it's a city park, whether it's a national park, wherever it is, get out and experience it. Because again, I believe that it's a starting point to discuss faith. When we look at the beauty of creation and say, man, where did this come from? How do we know that this is beautiful? It's an amazing starting point, I think, to begin to discuss, and even for somebody who feels far away from God, to embrace faith. I love the way John Muir writes about it. He says, in our best times, everything turns into religion. All the world seems a church, and the mountains altars. And just, again, biased, yes, but in the Pacific Northwest, especially in the summertime, is the crown jewel of creation. There's nowhere more beautiful. If you're live with us and you're right here, man, we're spoiled with that here. Get out and experience it. But regardless of our role to play in ecological, natural disasters and tragedies happening, or whether it's human-caused warfare of any scale, right, there's an apocalyptic feeling to those moments when we see them, whether they're from afar or whether we're experiencing them in person. Right? There's kind of a tinge of that apocalypse nature. And the Bible describes this sometimes as the day of the Lord. And this phrase pops up in different books of the Bible, but it's here in Joel. And so here's a description, the prophet Joel writing about this day of the Lord in chapter 2. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy hill. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is close at hand, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness. Like dawn spreading across the mountains, a large and mighty army comes, such as never was in ancient times, nor will ever be in ages to come. And so, what exactly is the day of the Lord, and why did we want it to come? Because it sounds terrible, right? What's going on here? Well, the day of the Lord is good or bad, depending on your perspective. To understand this simple phrase, as I said, that comes up multiple times in the Bible, view it this way. This is how just simplify it. The day of the Lord is God's complete victory, complete conquest over all that is wrong, over all the forces of darkness and evil, and that God eventually will completely rule and reign over all of them and make all wrongs right. And so, having the forces of light and good triumph over the forces of darkness and evil, right? Yes, please, we all want that. We all want to see that happen. The problem is that as humans, you and I are a mixed bag of light and darkness, if you will. And so, what does God do about that? What are his options? How does he help us not get swept up in this destruction in this day of the Lord? Well, we see that what's been made clear in the Bible is that Jesus' work allows us to not get swept up in that sin, in that judgment of evil, but it makes it possible for us to return to and be in a right relationship with God. And so, if you're far from God, you're uninterested in pursuing him, and you're just doing your own thing and you don't care about him, then yeah, the day of the Lord is not a joyful day for you. But if you are trying to seek him and pursue him and you want to know him, then the day of the Lord is a good thing as we come to know Jesus, because it's God becoming more clear, more real, more present. And so the question is, if God showed up in greater power and greater presence in your life, would you be ready to receive that? Would you be ready for that encounter if God showed up in a greater power and a greater presence? It's a question that you need to think through for yourself. Because it's clear, as you read from the book of Joel, God is using this locust swarm to wake his people up, to use it almost like an alarm clock to the ways they've drifted from him and to cease to pay attention to pursuing him. They've been asleep to that, and they need this awakening, if you will. Now, what their specific idolatry or their specific sin is, Joel actually does not list that out as many of the other prophets do. But again, we are very well aware as humans of our tendency to avoid doing what we know is right, to avoid doing what is good. Even simply the sin of just becoming spiritually apathetic, of not caring at all about God, considering his ways, okay, that's sin. I love what it says in the book of James, chapter 4, verse 17. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is a sin for them. And so in essence, God's saying here, this epic locust swarm that's so destructive that it was the greatest one for hundreds and hundreds of years in the history of God's people, it's like this buzzing to rouse his people from being asleep towards them. And we can be asleep towards God in our own lives. And so the question I just have for you is, what might it take to wake you up? What tragedy would it take to awaken you to your need to know your Creator, to know him as your sustainer and the one that provides? What would it take? And so Joel goes on to describe that very thing, that return that is possible for any and all of us. Joel 2, verse 12, even now declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. Man, don't miss this. God's heart is for his people to return, to return to a right relationship with him. At this time in the history of God's people, Joel would be referring to being in the right covenant relationship with God, that they're willingly choosing to do the things that God has asked them to do. And this is how their relationship with Yahweh would have been described prior to Jesus' work on the cross and his subsequent resurrection. But we see God's heart unchanged, and we see it from Old Testament to New. We see it captured here in the book of Joel, going on chapter 2, verse 25. I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten, the great locust and the young locust, the other locust and the locust swarm, my great army that I sent among you. You will have plenty to eat until you are full, and you will praise the name of the Lord your God, who has worked wonders for you. Never again will my people be shamed. Then you will know that I am in Israel, that I am the Lord your God, that there is no other. Never again will my people be shamed. Tragedy is inevitable, regardless of how much we precipitate it and contribute to it, how much it's outside of our own agency, whether it's natural disaster, whether it's personal, a health crisis, or a loss of relationship that you'll walk through. The question is not if you'll face tragedy. The question is, when you face tragedy, how will you mentally have the framework to understand how to walk through it well? And Joel gives us a different perspective than the culture around us gives us, that it's just random happenstance, being in the wrong place, wrong time, it's just meaningless, and there's nothing you can do about it. No, Joel gives us the perspective that any tragedy we might face can be an opportunity to be awoken to God's presence, to him being our creator. We can see him walking alongside us through the difficulties if we are willing to look for him and pursue him and follow him. And that's what remains the same from generation to generation. That when we give in to spiritual apathy, we stop pursuing God, there's always a chance to return to a pursuit of God. And those disaster moments, those desperate times, those tragedies, what if we begin to view them as an opportunity for them to be like an alarm clock to awaken us to God's presence, to the importance of pursuing him in our lives, and to follow in his ways rather than our own self-crafted moralities that are just shallow and brittle and are not consistent and don't hold up in the face of difficulty. The good news, you can return at any moment. You can pursue God at any moment. You don't have to wait for the worst locust swarm ever or whatever tragedy might befall you. You can return to following God now if you've drifted. You can continue to pursue him in your life now. And God is always gracious and compassionate, ready to receive us, as we just read in Joel 2. That's always been his heart for his people. But do you and I keep ourselves from experiencing it? That's really the heart of Joel's message here. He doesn't shy away from the loss that's self-inflicted, but he doesn't leave us with just, this is meaningless, nothing more to glean or to learn from here. No, God desires us to process tragedy and loss through a different lens. And so I love the way that the New Testament captures this ability to allow God to awaken us to our need for him. In the book of Ephesians, or the letter of Ephesians in chapter 5, beginning in verse 8, this is what we read, a very similar vein of this theme. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful to even mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. This is why it is said, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Pursuing God in the midst of the tragic doesn't erase the pain of tragedy. It doesn't erase the difficulty, but it does redefine what we can learn and who we can come to know through that process. And so I want to close by just giving us two prayers. You might be in one of two places this morning. You might have some pain, some grief from a tragedy that you've walked through. You might feel stuck in wanting God to be real, wanting to pursue him, but struggling with that question of, but how can he be good if he allowed this to happen? And so I would love to give you a prayer. And I'm actually going to pray this for you right now. but you can take this and use this. Maybe you just need to pray these words or something close to them. God, I bring my hurt and my pain to you. Remind me that you are the God who chose to suffer on my behalf in Jesus. But also, because of Jesus, I can know suffering and pain don't have to be the end of my story. Help me see what you want me to see in the midst of the tragic. In Jesus' name, amen. And so, for others of us, it's not that we're in a place yet where we have our tragedy, our pain, our grief, and we're in a place to bring that before God and He's bringing healing. For some of us, we're still struggling to even think it's possible that God could be good, that God could be there. But would you be willing to at least maybe offer a prayer to Him? Something along these lines. If you're just seeking, but there's an openness to say, okay, I want to know God. I want to know His goodness. I'm not sure it's there. Would you have the courage to maybe pray a prayer like this? God, I admit I struggle with seeing how you are really there or really good because of the tragic and awful things I see or I've experienced. But I don't want to just see meaningless in it anymore. I want to see how it's possible that you're good in the midst of the tragic experiences of life. Help me see my need for you more clearly. In Jesus' name, amen. And that's what I want to leave you with. Would you just this week take one of these two prayers, whichever most applies to the situation that you're in? You could take it, tweak it, make it work for where you're at. But would you just pray one of these simple prayers, just once daily? Maybe when you're getting up in the morning, maybe at a lunch break, maybe before your head hits the pillow at night. But just take some time in your day to pray one of these prayers, because I think as you do, it will begin to reframe and redefine how you think of tragedy and will give you a different strength to walk through it in. Thank you so much for joining us here, and we really hope that you join us next time as we continue in our series, Multiple Choice.